Hold on to your butt.
Da-da-da. You were saying?
Welcome to episode 105 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. Tonight I am joined by the guy that I nearly experienced a riot with in Baltimore when we were there last year, Darren Weeks. And tonight we are going to be talking about the 1861 riots. Welcome to the podcast.
And they weren't related to each other, which is pretty rare
No.
to think about when we talk about this. So how are you? What's going on? We're back in the saddle again, Mary.
We are
back in the saddle again.
Funny that we were just talking about Gerson's raid with Dr. Tim Smith on our book club.
Yeah, we were doing double duty tonight. We had Dr. Tim Smith with us. He would talk about Gerson's raid, his fantastic book, The Real Horse Soldiers. That was a good time. So thanks everybody who jumped on and joined us with that. But now we are beyond that. We have to put the horses in the stable, and we need to get back to business, Mary.
We do. And I'm about as good at intros as Soy Smith was at doing Calvary in the Western Theater.
And another job done.
Yep.
Exactly. So do you have anything you need to ask me?
I hadn't had a chance yet.
Okay, just making sure we haven't forgotten the drill.
Patience. What are you drinking tonight, and what mug are you drinking it out of?
I honestly did not think you were going to ask. Anyway, so I'm drinking what's called Fluffy Hazy IPA. And this is from Night Shift Brewery up the street here. And since it is April 19th and it is the beginning of the battles of Lexington and Concord, I am drinking it out of my Boston Red Sox mug. So believe it or not, it's the only Boston mug I have. So that's what I'm doing. So that's what I have. But again, thank you for asking. And what about you?
I am drinking Santilli IPA, also out of Night Shift Brewing in lovely Everett, Massachusetts. Actually, I don't know if Everett, Massachusetts is lovely. I don't think I've ever been there yet since I moved here about a year ago.
We'll just move on from that.
Yeah, we will. But yes, we are back with episode 105. We've taken a couple weeks off because we've been traveling. Anybody that follows us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or was on our YouTube live stream this last weekend, you know that we were doing some tours in the Western Theater, and we were also in Richmond too one weekend. So that was pretty cool. But
we were. But it's great to be recording again, Mary. It certainly is. Today we are discussing one of the uglier incidents of the early days of the Civil War, of course. And that would be Baltimore's Pratt Street riot. Again, on April 19th of 1861, an event that took place just right after the firing of Fort Sumter in Charleston. April 19th, we mentioned, sort of hinted at a second ago, is an important day in American history and a famous event around these parts. Has a lot to do with this riot, if you think about it, specifically the British advance to Lexington and Concord in 1775, when an advancing column of invaders was fired upon by locals defending their turf. It's examining, and by happenstance, Mary, today's date is April 19th too. So
well, we're recording, and even the names that come up in this about the riots that we're going to talk about, like the Minutemen is one of the names that are used, and that's one of the names from the Revolution as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of parallels. That April 19th attack on the Redcoats by the Massachusetts militia groups, was chided in England as a vicious attack on its soldiers by a gang of thugs here in Massachusetts. But it was also heralded as a heroic defense of their home against an invading army by the people here. Now, 86 years later to the day in Baltimore, Maryland, history is going to basically repeat itself, again involving men from Massachusetts, but this time they're going to be on the receiving end of this. But I think to get a full understanding of this Pratt Street riot, you have to kind of go back before the war to get a feel for the city and its people at this time. Now, Maryland was a slaveholding state, and many of its citizens considered themselves Southerners, and they still do. February of 1861, President-elect Abraham Lincoln, Mary, the guy with the hat we talk about.
The big hat.
He's going to be leaving Springfield, Illinois for Washington to take the oath of office that'll take place on March 4th of 1861. Now, like many states in the South, Lincoln was not Maryland's first choice for the White House. I mean, you look at the numbers, the 1860 election, Lincoln got 2,294 votes in that election from Maryland, 2.48% of the election, finishing dead last at 4 presidential choices, a mile behind their first choice, John C. Breckinridge, Mary of all people, a Southern Democrat who got almost 46% of the Maryland votes. You can see he was not the choice of a new generation, as they say, for this election. No, Lincoln was so unpopular in Maryland, you'd swear he was a Pittsburgh Steeler fan. That's how unpopular
It's
he was
so bad.
in that state. But anyway, Lincoln is en route to Washington, and he's going to stop and make speeches along the way. One of his scheduled stops was supposed to be in Baltimore, and he was supposed to be there on February 23rd, 1861. And, like many in the South, people in Maryland, were outraged in Lincoln's election. And soon whispers of assassination plots started to be heard. Now, we're not going to talk about this whole thing. We just kind of want to summarize to set the mindset of the state when this is all going on. The men in charge of Lincoln's safety, don't forget, there was no Secret Service at the time.
It's Alan Pinkerton, who the name will become familiar with in the Civil War as gathering intelligence for McClellan.
Right, that Scottish-born Chicago detective who had that National Detective Agency, and he's going to do more things later on, like you just said. But for now, his job was to protect the hindquarters of Abraham Lincoln and make sure they're delivered safely along to Washington. Pinkerton, he's hearing these assassination rumors as well, and he's convinced they're true because he kind of has to.
Yep.
Especially the ones that he's hearing that are based in that heavy pro-sesh town of Baltimore. When Lincoln, when he arrives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Pinkerton told Lincoln, basically to take off that big hat of his. And when they got to Philadelphia, which was the last stop before Baltimore, he had Lincoln change cars. They put him in the car that carries all the invalids, and they cut off all the telegraph communication to it. They put Mary and her three children there in a different car. Yep. And they did this obviously, to protect him. And of course, Lincoln's going to regret it. He's going to say later on, people call him
it makes him look like a coward, and the press
right.
had a real field day with it because I'm sure many of our listeners have seen the famous cartoon of Lincoln, he's like sneaking around and he's got like the cloak on and they put a Scottish cap on him and stuff. But Lincoln has been on this journey, from Springfield, Illinois for a few weeks at this point. And, Pinkerton's kind of been sniffing things out, and I think they're expecting assassination plots just because, it's definitely, the war is in the air. Like, keep in mind when Lincoln is in Baltimore, the Civil War has not started yet. It's still a few weeks away. Actually a couple months at this point, but they're still scared and tensions are still really, really high. And of course, it's not as much of you don't think you're going to get an assassination attempt in a northern state, but you go into Maryland, which is southern, then it's like, okay, this is, kind of shit's getting real when we're in this state, right?
Well, Pinkerton did have a real concern, though. Baltimore, like you said, was a hotbed of secessionism before the time. He never did find a real plot. There was a local barber there. His name was Cipriani Ferrandini. He ran a barbershop that apparently was a gathering place for Southern sympathizers. When Pinkerton questioned Ferrandini, he denied the plot, but he did say Lincoln surely must die.
You got to wonder if some of that is hyped up as well, just to kind of,
probably.
It's like is Pinkerton telling who he is? He's like, I'm kind of this, I'm coming ahead of Abraham Lincoln. I want to know if anything's going on. And it's like, well, I'll just start stirring the pot with this now, local gossip mill. There might be a plot. There might not be. We don't know for sure,
Right. But regardless, the assassination plot, but really, the subsequent riot that we're going to talk about was really started 1831 is when it really started. 1831, the city of Baltimore passed a law prohibiting trains from going directly through the city. So if anyone's going to Washington from the north, they would have to disembark at a train station just outside the city, and they have to take a carriage across town just a few miles away, where they would pick up a second train, which would then let them proceed south to Washington. So there was that gap between the train stations that was the real security concern for Pinkerton. And later is what's going to cause that Pratt Street riot. So if you look at it that way, now fast forward, he's going to make it through Baltimore by taking that earlier unannounced train. And it was scheduled to get to the Calvert Street station. When it pulled up, there was a big crowd waiting to greet the president, but it was only Mary and the kids. Much of the disappointment for the people who wanted to see the guy with the hat.
Yep. They were just as popular as he was, though.
Oh, of course he was, absolutely. But by April 1861, Baltimore had a real tough reputation of being a nest of secessionist vipers that hated the North. The town was actually referred to as Mob Town.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it was called all along. And it goes back to 1850s. Speaking of going back real quick, Baltimore was the location of all that mob violence of rival gangs called the Pug Uglies. And think of the movie Gangs of New York that you like.
That's exactly what I was just thinking.
That was Baltimore. Yep. That's what it was. Exactly what it was. So this was the attitude of Baltimore when Fort Sumter was fired on April 1861. And especially a few days after, when Lincoln called up those 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion that had started in South Carolina. So Maryland, for Lincoln, it was a problem, Mary. It's a problem. And it hadn't seceded yet, but due to the proximity of Washington, it needed to stay out of Southern hands. Now, if you think about it, if Maryland secedes, Washington is going to be surrounded on all sides. Yep. Now, as much as Lincoln, we talked in previous episodes that Kentucky was the key. No, he absolutely had to keep Maryland neutral. He had to.
Yeah. Now, the other thing, too, with Maryland, though, is, not just its proximity to D.C., but the fact that it is, I think we can call it a railway hub, even though it's kind of a pain in the Savannah to get, from, like, you got to switch trains or whatever. It just sounds a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. But I think that's one of the reasons, too, is they needed it to transport troops as well. Because you think of how many troops are going to start coming through that city, especially after the Civil War starts.
Oh, there's no question. But when everything's going on, when you factor in the fact that Baltimore is a powder keg, there's 75,000 volunteers that needed to put down the rebellion. It really, it infuriated a lot of people in the South, including Baltimore. And because of the city's location, any troops that are going to come from the North to Washington at some point are likely going to have to pass directly through the city. And don't forget that issue with the trains we talked about from 1831. Yep. That's really the genesis of the whole thing. Now, despite thoughts in Washington that this really wouldn't be a problem since they were merely passing through, like those people that go back to Lexington and Concord again, 1775, the residents saw this as an invasion. And that's what you have to really think about it. You have one group who looks at these people as these militia, these marauders, these gangs, versus the people in the city who looked at themselves as defending their city against an invasion. So despite being neutral, Maryland did see this as an invasion, and they wanted many in the state, Maryland wanted the state to secede. Yeah. And so the concept of the Union troops marching through the state to fight another southern state, it pissed them off more than they already were. Forget April 12th firing at Fort Sumter. Think about this now, because now they're going to have these troops march through their city. If you study World War II, and we don't do a lot of World War II stuff here, but there was a similar event that took place with the Germans went to march through Belgium. Yeah. Same exact thing. They were expecting no problems, and they got problems. And so when you look at that, it's conceptually you can see why the northern people would have missed the boat on this one. But that's what happened. So the good thing about the Pratt Street riots is there's a lot of colorful characters here.
Very much.
That maybe people don't know about. So, introduce a couple of them. The first one is going to be the mayor of Baltimore. His name is George Brown. And no one really knows who he is, but he was a 48-year-old Baltimore resident who has been elected the mayor the previous year in 1860. So he's new. On April 17th, he's going to issue a proclamation to the city urging the citizens to calm the F down. Yep. And avoid harsh speech, he said. So obviously you wouldn't have lasted long in Baltimore. But that's what he says. He says, remain calm and avoid harsh speech. Okay, that's what he says.
Sure, dude.
And so, but that's because he could feel it. The tension's in the air. The next person is Baltimore's police chief. His name is George Kane. Now we're going to talk a lot about him, especially towards the end too. He's very pro-Southern. He was named the Marshal of Police in 1860. He was that efficient skullcracker type cop. He had no sympathy for hooligans, for gangs in the streets. he made it his job to squash the mobs that was running through the city. He was big on efficiency, big on discipline. That's who he was. So Kane, though, he was so Southern, he bled sweet tea. That was his other issue,
oh my
too.
God.
He wanted no part of the Union troops coming through his city. And when he got wind of the impending troops, he telegrammed one of the agents in the Philadelphia Wilmington Railroad in Philly for confirmation. And the telegram is going to say, is it true that an attempt will be made to pass the volunteers from the north intended to war upon the south over your road today? So he wants to know what the heck is going on. Now, people in Washington weren't stupid here. They knew what was going on, too. And they knew there was a potential disaster with this. So on April 18th, Secretary of War, a guy named Simon Cameron Mary at this time.
This is the guy before Stanton.
Right. He's going to message the Maryland governor, a guy named Thomas Hicks. And he's going to warn him that whatever the hell you do, you better not try to stop these Union troops. You better not disrupt them. You better not. Be good for goodness sake. That's what he told him. Now, as you can imagine, this news of these Union troops potentially coming through Baltimore, it spread quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, and basically it spread faster than the time it does for a DQ blizzard to melt in a summer day. That's how fast this news passed through the town. So April 18th, 1861, is in the first Union troops are going to start to approach Baltimore. Now, these are 4 companies from Pennsylvania, with the Pennsylvania militia, okay, and 2 companies of artillery. They're going to arrive at the President Street Station, okay? Now, remember that 1831 city law, Mary, we talked about, that prohibited the trains going all the way through the city. So what does that mean? It means the troops have to get off the train, they have to disembark, and they're going to march their way down Pratt Street, past Baltimore Harbor. You know, they're going to pass, all the harbor, all those stores right along the front there. And they're going to get on a different train at a place called Camden Station, which is right next to Camden Yards, the baseball field, if you're
amazing baseball field.
It is. It's a nice place down there. So they're going to get off the train. They're going to walk by that Hooters. They're going to go by that Irish bar. God. They're going to go all the way down towards Camden. So most of these Union troops at this point didn't have uniforms. They were dressed in civilian clothes. They didn't really have any weapons. They had to march on foot. But this, for the most part, there was too many men to ride on carriages, so they had to walk. Now, despite all those Southern leanings that Marshal Kane I talked about, he cared more than that. He cared about discipline in his city. And so even though these Union troops were going to march to the city, he knew he needed his police to protect them, to keep order in the city. He was a professional. And he made sure that there was enough police presence to guard the troops as they made it from all the way down Pratt Street, from Bolton Street, where the President's Station is, all the way down to the Camden Station. So he made sure. Now, by then, though, all the hooligans and the people had come on the street. Now, the hooligans we'll talk about in a second, because that's kind of unfair. But the crowds are gathering, and they're yelling. The troops are going to start walking down the street. Now, they're not wearing uniforms. They're wearing civilian clothes. But they're going to start getting screamed at and yelled at. Some of these Baltimore people are going to start throwing rocks at them. Yeah. But it wasn't really much of a violent situation besides catcalls. There was some rocks. Yeah. There was a black servant named Nicholas Biddle who got hit in the head, but he really wasn't hurt all that bad. But it was kind of a test run. That first wave of Union troops did make it to Camden Station without any real incident, and they got on that train. They headed down to Washington. But the problem was going to be the next day. Yeah. Unfortunately for the Union, this is going to change on the next day, on April 19th, when men from the 6th Massachusetts are going to attempt to do the same thing. Yeah. Right? Yeah.
And they depart from Boston on April 17th, and they are going to head towards Baltimore. And they get warned on the way there that something could happen to them. When they get there, that there could be something happening, and these are guys like, just like the Pennsylvania guys, they're just gonna pass through. They've got to, switch trains. So that means they've got to walk through or either go in a carriage through part of the city to get to Camden Yard, to get on the Baltimore and Ohio to DC.
Right. So the sixth mass is going to, the night before, they're going to be spending the night, they're going to be in Philadelphia, the night of the 18th, okay? And they're going to be sleeping on a floor at a place called the Girard House in Philly. They're going to be awakened by an alarm bell at 1 o'clock in the morning, which is ironic because 1 o'clock in the morning is also the same time that Paul Revere and William Dawes sounded their alarm bell in 1775. So there are a lot of historical, comparisons with this. They just are. Some of these massmen, by the way, were descendants, speaking of the Battle of Battle Road, of Lexington and Concord. Company E of the Sixth Mass was called the Davis Guards, named after Captain Isaac Davis, who was that first officer killed in the Revolution, who fell leading that charge at the Old North Bridge in Concord. Yeah. They were named after him. The Sixth Mass was commanded by Colonel Edward Jones. Yeah. He was a 32-year-old merchant from Pepperell, Massachusetts. He was part of the Massachusetts State Militia since 1854. He was the first militia officer in the state to sign up when Lincoln called for the volunteers. So they were booming with pride. The regiment was encamped at Faneuil Hall in Boston when they were training. And before they got their muskets and they headed south on April 17th, 1861, no doubt they were probably at the Green Dragon Tavern. I bet they were.
How appropriate because you're wearing your Green Dragon shirt today. That's it's an amazing place. If you find yourself in Boston, visit the Green Dragon.
Yeah, it's still there. It's still there. But in Boston, when they left, they were greeted by huge crowds cheering. When they got to Philly, they had huge crowds cheering. And they were expecting nothing but, a Laurel and Hardy handshake wherever they went. But when they got to Baltimore, they were going to be surprised by that. Now, you mentioned before how they were tipped off. Mm-hmm. Before leaving Philly, Colonel Jones is going to get the tip off about the city of Baltimore and the reputation of being called Mob Town. And it's really why he woke up the regiment at 1 o'clock in the morning, to be honest, because he was hoping that he could get into the city in GTFO before everybody woke up. That's kind of what he was thinking.
Yeah, but he still gives a speech to his troops.
He does.
As well. What he says to him is, the regiment will march through Baltimore in column of sections, arms at will. You will undoubtedly be insulted, abused, and perhaps assaulted, to which you must pay no attention whatever. But march with your faces to the front and pay no attention to the mob, even if they throw stones, bricks, or other missiles. But if you are fired upon and any one of you is hit, your officers will order you to fire. Do not fire into any promiscuous crowds, but select any man whom you may see aiming at you and be sure you drop him.
So he's, unlike the Philadelphia guys the day before, these guys have weapons, and they're going to get 20 rounds of ammunition for every one of these men. They're going to have weapons. They're going to have muskets. So Jones tells them, don't start any crap. But if anyone goes at you, drop them. Okay.
Can you imagine saying that to a bunch of masked guys?
Well, tell me about it. It's like Southie on a Friday night.
I know. I go to Boston like 3 or 4 days a week, and I'm like, wow, if I had been, if I told any Bostonians that, they'd be like, F that. I'm not doing that.
Right. But these are green volunteers being told to shoot civilians if necessary. Just keep that in mind, too. So, there are two sides anticipating a conflict now with these Massachusetts men approaching the city. The Baltimore people are thinking, we're being invaded. We need to defend our city. The mass guys are like, if we get in trouble, we have to defend ourselves. Here's the problem, though. For whatever reason, Colonel Jones, he does not telegram Mayor Brown to let them know their arrival time, because Mayor Brown would have arranged for Police Marshal Kane to have the police out when they arrived. Now, my guess is that Jones did not trust the Baltimore mayor for the arrival time, wanted to sneak in and sneak out. But regardless, that lack of trust is going to cause a big issue. And for the most part, the 6th Massachusetts was 850 guys. And they're going to arrive in Baltimore, President Street Station, and right around 10 o'clock in the morning is when they're actually going to get there. The distance from President Street Station to Camden Station is 1.2 miles exactly. I walked it. Mary, you stumbled it, but we got there.
I walked it just fine.
Okay, sure. It's you walked it, but it was a stagger. It was 1.2 miles is the exact distance to have. That's quite the gauntlet. Like I mentioned before, unlike the Pennsylvania men, these guys are wearing their blue uniforms, not civilian uniforms. They're carrying muskets, and they're armed. And they also have an itchy trigger finger because what they were told.
Yep.
Now,
Well, I certainly would going into that. Like, geez, what am I going into? You know, like I'm a new recruit, and I'm being told by, kind of my supervisor, like, oh, don't worry, you might get stones, bricks, or other missiles thrown at you, but just ignore it unless they fire at you. Then use your weapon, kind of thing.
yeah. Well, I mean, it was percolating. Colonel Jones, he anticipated trouble, and so he felt that marching through the city on foot was like waving a red flag at a bull. He thought
Hmm.
that didn't make any sense. So what he does, instead of walking, he's going to have the train cars detached, and he's going to keep the men in the trains, and he's going to put horses, a team of horses, to take them down Pratt Street. Pratt Street had it had like a rail, so the train would stay on the track, but it wasn't like an official train. All they do was
Yep.
have a horse-drawn, I guess, horse-drawn carriage, but it was on a track. That's what they were going to do. And there were 10 total cars, and they're going to load the men onto these cars, and the horses are going to pull them down Pratt Street, thinking it's going to protect the men. If stuff gets thrown, they're going to
Yep.
be in the cars. Um, so basically, you had an additional 1,200 unarmed men from another Pennsylvania militia group under Colonel William Small, who was also there. Now, just like the day before, they were not armed and they did not have
Yep.
uniforms. But what that means is by 11 o'clock in the morning, you're going to basically have the mobs of Baltimore are going to be lining the streets waiting for all these guys. Contrary to the mental image of a mob, by the way, these were not just all hooligans. A lot of them were very self-respecting citizens. This
Yeah.
was not a Maple Leafs playoff crowd in the street here, man. This was a lot of people these are lawyers, merchants.
Yeah.
These are respected people in Baltimore who were out to defend their city. Because, like I said earlier, they felt they were being invaded, and they came to defend their city from what they consider was an invading army. It's also to make this distinction because it really shows the mindset of the city of Baltimore at the beginning of the war, as far as how they felt the Union troops were versus themselves. So by late morning, the Union is loaded into these 10 cars, these Union men, the 6th Mass, and they're going to begin their journey down towards Camden Station. And as the cars moved along, it seemed like the citizens got more and more angry as they got down Pratt Street. The first few cars did arrive at Camden Station without much of an issue. It was those last couple of cars that were really got bad. It's like you can just imagine it. What starts out as insults, it degenerated into rocks being thrown and bricks. And soon citizens at this point were starting to try to block the paths of the cars so they couldn't get down Pratt Street. Because don't forget, they're being pulled by horses on a track.
Yep.
So each car carried 4 companies. The 10th and last car held companies C, D, I, and L. This is 220 total men. They're going to be under the command of a Captain Alan Folensby. He's a 37-year-old guy from Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, which is just north of here. He happened to be the captain of Company C. He's in charge of these 4 companies, these 220 men in this 10th and final car. Now, Colonel Jones of the 6th Mass, who commanded the entire regiment, he was in the lead car.
Yep.
And he soon heard that Pratt Street, the last couple of cars rather, was being stopped and being obstructed. And this is the cars containing Folensby's companies. They couldn't get through. They blocked the road, and they were stuck. So, unable to continue in the car, Folensby is going to order his probably the worst thing he'll probably do. He's going to order his men out of the car. And you're going to have to make the rest of the trip on foot.
Yeah, and as soon as they do that, they start to be attacked with bricks and paving stones and people with their pistols on them. It's it's just escalating, as you say.
But here's the thing, though. Folensby, unlike Jones, what does he tell them? He says, under no circumstances are you to shoot on anybody. Unless you feel your life is literally in danger, you do not shoot on anybody. We're gonna walk up the street. We're gonna walk shame this. We're gonna get there as fast as we possibly can. And by the cars that had been arriving at Camden Station at this point were all damaged. The windows are broken with bricks and rocks. I mean, they ran the gauntlet. So right around now, this angry mob is grown to over 10,000 people on Pratt Street. Now, you've been there. You can see how small that road is. Just picture 10,000 people.
Oh, it is. When we were doing that, if you go to Baltimore, you can kind of walk the route that they walked, and there's like Civil War trail signs as
Yeah.
well along the way. But yeah, I was like, wow, I can't believe, it's like wow, we're walking where this all happened,
But here's the thing: police police Marshal Kane, his troops are there and they are protecting the men. What they kind of do is this: most of the trouble wasn't coming from the sides or the front; it was from behind. It was from the
Yeah.
savannah.
Ooh.
Okay, so you had the troops marching, and you had the mob behind following them, throwing stuff.
Yeah.
So what does Kane do? He has his police line up and walk between them. So you've got the six masked guys from those four companies marching. You've got the mob in the back, and in the middle is a line of police, just separating the two, not letting anybody get through. That's kind of what's going on. So Fallsby is gonna have to run the gauntlet. He's gonna have to make that walk. Now, what happens is, as you can imagine, the troops get a little nervous,
Yeah.
and they start to jog and they start to run. And as they start to run, it seems to incite the mob. It's like running from a dog or something. The dog's gonna chase
Yep.
you down.
Or from a turkey here in
Oh
Mass.
God! Seeing the Union men starting to run energized the crowd
Yeah.
to really get into it, because at this point they smelled the fear and they were on him. The leader of the Baltimore mob, his name was George Koenig, and he was seen carrying a rebel flag in one hand and a chain in the other.
I picture
That's
him
who this
looking
guy-
like Bill the Butcher in a way from Gangs in New
probably.
York,
Yeah, he'll get arrested for this later on. But it wasn't too long until that six Massachusetts were completely surrounded now. Rocks are raining down on them, despite that the Baltimore police doing everything they
Yeah.
can to protect them. There's only so much you can do. I mean, it's ironic that the only thing standing between the mob and the six Massachusetts was a police chief, a Southern sympathizer who probably hated their actual existence, but he was a professional and he was going to do what he
Yeah.
could. The six Mass is going to march along, and they're going to get to Gay Street, which is by Smith's Wharf, right on the water there. This is the point where the mob is going to overwhelm the police. They're going to bum rush the line, and they're going to get to the cops, and they're going to get on the troops. And at this point, it's every man for himself.
Mhm.
The men, and this is the point now where the six Mass feels they have no choice. Their
Yeah.
lives are in danger. So what do?
They fire into the mob, and
They
then
fire into the mob.
and this incites this giant fight between soldiers, and the Baltimore police are involved, and all of them. So think of that kind of that big fight at the beginning of the movie Gangs in New York. That's what it is. It's like people fighting with each other, and it's crazy. And you know that some people are fighting against each other that are probably supposed to be on the same side, but it's like everything's getting mixed up and it's becoming very chaotic. But you have to remember going into this, you have to remember kind of like the mood of this. Now, keep in mind, this is, what is it, like a week after Fort Sumter's been fired upon, and this is happening.
yeah.
Yeah. And so the tension it's going to be pretty high with this, and nobody really knows what's going to happen. Like the first battle hasn't been fought yet. I mean, Sumter, of course, but it's the tensions are really, really high, and it just completely explodes here in Baltimore.
It does. Up at Camden Station now, a guy named Thomas Garrett, he's the president of the Baltimore Ohio Railroad. He's going to turn to Colonel Jones and he's going to say, hey, not for nothing, your soldiers are firing upon the people in the streets here. Jones is going to respond back, they must have been fired upon first then, because those are my orders. And so and Garrett's going to say, nope, they're firing.
It's like, well, we got other orders.
Yeah, I mean, everything at this point, I mean, it's just total hysteria. Around this time, the first Union soldier is going to be killed, and that's going to be a private named Luther Ladd, 17 years old. He's a mechanic from Lowell, and he's going to be marching past Gay Street, and somebody on the roof is going to drop a big piece of iron and get him right in the head. He's going to die right in the street. That's how he's going to go. Harper's Weekly is going to later publish Ladd's photo, calling him the first victim of the war. He probably was.
Yeah.
Realistically.
Yeah. Even though I was reading about him, and even though he's killed by civilians or whatever, he's still kind of the first casualty of the Civil War on the Union side.
I mean, for the most part, that's exactly what it was. One of the rioters, he's going to describe it. He's going to write, a soldier struck by a stone fell at my feet As he fell, he dropped his musket, which was immediately seized by Edward Beatty, a port customs officer who raised it to his shoulder and fired into the column. He then asked if anyone had a cartridge. I gave him one and showed him how to reload. The men responded with a volley, and the crowd responds with pistol shots, stones, and clubs. So now you've got both sides firing at each other now. So you can see this is getting worse and worse and worse. This is bad day for Mother. So this is complete mayhem. The troops and the civilians are both under fire. This is an absolute blood frenzy now of just crazy violence. And again, you have the Baltimore residents in their minds, they're defending their city against an army. And these Union troops who have been receiving accolades everywhere they went are going, what the hell is going on here? Captain Follinsby, he's going to order a battalion to form on the street and try to control his men, and bricks are falling on them from all directions. They're getting fired on by bullets now from surrounding buildings. So he's going to tell his troops, forget it, fire at will. You do what you got to do. The troops began to run around, and when they did, again, that mob was more excited by watching these troops run. There was absolute panic.
Yep.
The city included some of the most respected citizens I mentioned before. This was not Goderich, Mary, on Fridays here. Okay,
this is pretty tame compared to Goderich.
Well, present in the mob was a lawyer named McHenry Howard, who happened to be the grandson of Francis Scott Key, who would later become a soldier in the Confederate Army. Yep. So he was there. Right around this moment, I got him. George Brown, the mayor of Baltimore.
Yeah.
He's going to arrive, and he's going to do his best Kevin Bacon Animal House routine, saying, all is well, try to slow it down. He's going to note that he saw the troops were firing wildly, sometimes backwards, sometimes over their shoulders while the mob was pursuing, in shouts and stones and the occasional pistol shot. The uproar was furious. That's what he was saying. Now, like a lot of these we talk about, it's kind of tough to imagine. This one's kind of easy to see what the hell's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm imagining kind of like, I don't know, it reminds me of Gangs in New York, just the chaos of that first fight in the opening scene of the movie. But again, you have to remember like how high tensions are as well, like as they're going into this. And you also don't know, it'd be interesting to read newspapers in Baltimore in the days leading up to this. Like what was the, like, was there anything being done to kind of fuel this as well? Like what kind of rumors were going around in that, like that barbershop that you mentioned, everything is building one after the other. And it's like I said, it's like a powder keg and it's going to explode, and it does in Baltimore.
Well, Mayor Brown is going to find Follinsby, introduce himself. Hey, I'm the mayor of Baltimore, by the way. And he begged him to tell his troops to stop running. He goes, whatever you do, because your running is inciting them. Just stop running. And Follinsby, he did by all accounts. But Follinsby's like to the mayor, not for nothing, but why are they attacking us? We didn't do anything. We're just walking through here. Brown saw the situation later and just told him. And this is the amazing thing about it. Brown tells him, here's what you should do. Stop running. Set up a battle line, fire a volley at them. Now, how many mayors do you know are going to tell an army to fire into your own citizens? But he figures that's how it's going to slow them down.
Yeah.
And it's pretty remarkable when you think about it.
Yeah.
This rolling violence is going to continue, and there's going to be a group of about 50 Baltimore police officers under Marshal Kane. They're going to arrive, and they're going to start busting heads of the mob because they're going to try to stop this riot where the violence is taking place. Kane is going to lead a group of police with pistols drawn. Kane himself is going to yell at the crowd, keep back or I will shoot.
Mm-hmm.
And then at this point, he says that at this point when the police pulled their guns on him, he said the mob recoiled like water from a rock. That was a phrase he used.
Wow.
So, I mean, what's crazy about this whole thing, though, was both sides consider themselves to be victims.
Yep.
If you really think about it, the Union troops felt they were being attacked without provocation, while the Baltimore people felt that they were being invaded.
Yep.
What resulted is an absolute complete melee. The Baltimore Sun, the next day, is going to write about this. And they're going to write, as one of the soldiers fired, he was struck with a stone and knocked down as he attempted to arise another stone struck him in the face. He crawled into a store and begged pitifully for his life. That's what the newspaper said. Yeah. I mean, but not all these rioters, we've talked about defending their city, not all these rioters were full of patriotism either. I mean, many Baltimore stores were looted, buildings were damaged.
Well, it's a typical thing that happens during a riot. Like shit's gonna go down that people are gonna be like, well, I'm not on either side, but hey, here's a store. Let me walk in and loot it.
Go crazy. Yeah. Telegraph lines that cut, somebody spray painted Led Zepp rules on the side of the school building. I mean,
anarchy signs everywhere.
Absolutely. So a lot of things were going on with this. By this time, the 6th Mass, they're still moving. Mm-hmm. They approach Light Street, and 4 total soldiers at this point had now been killed. This is Private Addison Whitney, Charles Taylor, as well as Corporal Needham, Sumner Needham, along with Private Ladd. So they've died in this riot so far. 4 U.S. troops have died. Bonesby is going to order a line established at Washington Station, and a volley was fired into the crowd. So he's going to fire that volley.
Yep.
Many in the crowd had pistols. They fired back. I mean, they were still tossing bricks. I mean, where the hell are they getting all these damn bricks? But they're getting bricks.
They're just grabbing them randomly. Is there a brickyard nearby?
Yeah. Bricks for sale. Bricks. Give me 10. But it really, and on the other side of it, at this point, there were 12 Baltimore citizens who had also been killed, including a child. And it was William Reed, who was sitting on a dock and he was shot in the stomach by an Aaron bullet, and he died, bled to death.
Oh, God.
So
terrible.
It is, absolutely is. But this 6th Mass is finally going to make it to Camden Station. They're going to run that gauntlet. They're going to make it. And when they got there, it was about 1:30 in the afternoon. They got loaded into cars waiting for them, these train cars. They were safely on the train to Washington. But these soldiers at this point were bloodthirsty for vengeance themselves. There were stories they were firing out the window at people, anybody was walking by. I mean, they were pissed. Yeah. I mean, they lost 4 of their own by simply walking down the street. And for the most part, Colonel Jones, he wanted nothing to do with this. He says, just stop. He goes, I'm afraid the mob is going to go down the road and derail the train and kill us all. So just stop. And eventually what's going to happen is they're going to finally get going. The 6th Mass, those 10 companies, what's left of them, are going to get to Washington, D.C. later in the afternoon. But the thing about it, though, is with the troops gone, that's not the end.
No, it's not. And I think the one thing, too, to remember is, these are guys that are coming from the north, but they're coming from Massachusetts, which is very much, I mean, obviously it's a northern city. There's a very different attitude there towards what is going on. I think when they get to Baltimore, they start to see how the South feels. They start to see that this is a war and that it's like, it's kind of like, wow, this is real now. Like, these people are angry. They don't want to be they're seeing a completely different attitude, I think, to what they've encountered, not just in Massachusetts, but in New York and Pennsylvania and all that. And Baltimore, Maryland is a completely different ballgame for these guys.
Well, if you're right, the troops are gone now. If you're the mayor, you're Governor Hicks, you're Mayor Brown, your police officer Kane, you're sitting around thinking, what did we just do? And what they really did was the city of Baltimore declared war on the United States that day.
Yeah.
If you really think of it, they knew it. And they knew that. And, Mayor Brown, don't forget, he's been in office for about a year.
Yeah.
And he knows that, they're in for it. Now, this is a guy who put himself in harm's way. But he knew that no matter what happens, this cannot happen again. We cannot allow more federal troops coming through this city. Yeah. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. Brown was not a Southern sympathizer, but he was an anti-war Democrat. He doesn't want to see his city burned down. So what happens is the Maryland state legislature, they're going to pass a law giving all police powers in Baltimore to Marshal George Kane. So for the most part, Kane is going to be the most powerful person in the city at this point. They're going to give him the keys to the entire store. Now, he's a hothead anyway. He's a pro-secession, hates the North,
Yep.
but he's a professional policeman, but that's who he was. And due to this riot and the 12 citizens being killed, including that small boy, Baltimore got deeper and deeper in Southern sympathy and hatred to the North. Yeah. It's not going to get better. So what happens, the city of Baltimore is going to call a meeting. They're going to have an emergency meeting. It's going to be called the Monument Square meeting. It's just 3 hours after the mass troops have gone. That's how soon this meeting is. And they all agreed that no more federal troops coming to the city. Cannot be done. No way. Maryland, the governor, Governor Hicks, who was not very popular. They didn't like him too much. He was a non-secession type politician. He was not pro-union, but he wasn't pro. But they didn't like him because he wasn't a secession politician. He agreed, and he basically said, "Well, we need to bring this flag of the city together, and the flag is going to be in defiance of Lincoln's actions, which was sending an army to a peaceful city to put down a rebellion in another state." Hicks is going to say at this meeting, now that he's changing his colors now, he's going to say, I coincide with what your worthy mayor has said. I bow in submission to the people. I am a Marylander. I love the Union, but I will suffer my right arm to be torn from my body before I will raise it to strike a sister state. I mean, it's a lot of the dialogue you hear in South Carolina is now coming into Maryland.
Exactly. Yep.
So Hicks, what's Hicks basically saying? He's saying Maryland is seceding from the Union. That's kind of what he's saying.
Yeah.
Governor Hicks and Mayor Brown messaged Lincoln to tell him their decision about no more troops coming through our city. It's not going to happen. Don't try it again. The city also called on militia groups from around Maryland and Virginia to come in to help defend the city. The Frederick Rifles from Maryland showed up. Rumors the Rosewoods Clown came. So there's a lot of
the Rosewoods Clown.
But they were all basic. And don't forget, this is 2 days after Virginia seceded. 2 days. This is all going on. So you're having these militia groups all kind of converging into Maryland to help defend the state. I always think of the Warriors movie. They're all kind of all these gangs getting together, right? Baltimore was on the ready and was all set, to turn that city into a fortress based on these rumors. The more troops were going to be coming, and those rumors started floating. More troops are coming. More troops are coming. So just after midnight now, on April 20th, a telegraph is going to arrive telling Police Marshal Kane that guess what? A regiment from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania is on its way. And basically, he, along with Mayor Brown and Governor Hicks, they all agreed that, we need to do something. So what do they start doing? They start tearing up their own railroad tracks or burning bridges. They destroyed 5 miles of railroad tracks. They burned the Gunpowder River Bridge as well as the Black River Bridge. And they cut all the telegraph lines that surrounded the railroads. They're going to just make it difficult. They're going to do it. The next morning, April 20th, guess what happens? All the mobs start showing up again. Yep. They're all coming back out on the streets, right? They're ready to attack the next troops that come through the city. It's a game now. Now, in the North, as you can imagine, the Northern papers were furious at this.
Yeah,
they wanted Baltimore attacked. They said, the Civil War has opened up and exploded in the city of Baltimore. What are you going to do about it? Mayor Brown, he was authorized to raise $500,000 to help defend Baltimore, and he got the money from local merchants, local banks, including a sizable donation from a wealthy local merchant named Johns Hopkins, who Mayor Brown actually would return the favor in 1876 by helping found a university in his name in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University. Yeah. So you can trace that back to these Pratt Street riots.
That's very interesting. It's very cool.
It just is. But by the morning of April 21st, Mayor Brown is going to learn that 5,000 to 10,000 Union troops are just a couple of miles away, and they're heading right into Baltimore. So he's thinking, oh, shit, we're in for it now. So church bells, this is a Sunday morning. Church bells start ringing to warn the citizens. Many of them are already sitting in church hearing about this. It turns out that it's not 5,000 to 10,000 troops. It's 2,500 unarmed Pennsylvania volunteers again from Harrisburg under a guy named General George C. Wynkoop, who'd smartly decided when they got to a place called Cockeysville, Maryland, that we ain't going to Baltimore. You got your friggin' mind. So Wynkoop's going to stop them. It's safe to assume, by the way, that if Wynkoop entered Baltimore, Maryland officially secedes. I think at that very moment they're going to officially
I think
secede.
so too. I think he made a good decision here.
Now, what's funny, later in the war, this Wynkoop guy, he's going to have cavalry run-ins later on with Nathan Bedford Forrest and John Hunt Morgan. And you know where he's buried? He's buried in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, in the shadows of the Yingling Brewery.
Nice.
Is where Coop. Wow. So if you want to go there for the tour, a few drinks, go see Wynkoop. But around this time now, Mayor Brown is going to be. He's actually going to go to Washington to meet with Lincoln, Simon Cameron, and Winfield Scott. And where they all basically agree, okay, here's the deal. We're going to leave Baltimore alone. Any future troops from the Union are going to have to find a different route. They have to get a whole shitload of dimes, and they're going to have to go find a different way into town. Yep. That's how it's going to work.
Yep.
But Lincoln didn't promise. He goes, I can't promise you that no troops will ever enter Baltimore, but we got you, okay? Now, if you're Mayor Brown, you're like, okay, thank God. Because you finally feel calm for the first time in a couple of days. He's going to return to Baltimore feeling confident that he helped stop a potential catastrophe. But what he didn't know was this. Before the meeting even happened, Lincoln had decided he was going to punish Baltimore and he was going to keep Maryland in the Union at all costs. It was just too important not to, like we said before.
Yeah.
6 days later, April 27th, 1861, Lincoln is going to impose martial law in Baltimore and a General Order 100, which suspended civil law, denied habeas corpus, and giving soldiers the power to arrest citizens without cause.
Yep.
So if you're Mayor Brown, don't forget, this is the guy who put his life on the line to keep the peace, including put his own life in jeopardy. He himself is going to get arrested on September 12th, 1861, without cause. He will spend 14 months in prison in Fort Warren here in Boston Harbor. That's where he's going to go. That's where he's going to get sent.
Yeah, that's
Police Marshal Kane. He was the one who protected the 6 Massachusetts troops as they entered the city. He's going to get arrested. He's a big Southern sympathizer, but he's going to get arrested too on June 27th of 1861. Ironically, when the 6 Massachusetts comes back to Baltimore under Benjamin Spoon's butler, who's in charge, he's going to basically take possession of the city thing called Federal Hill, and he's going to have George Kane arrested. Now, George Kane is a fascinating study. If you ever studied George Kane, but he's also going to be a guest of the state of Massachusetts here, Fort Warren. He's going to be sent up here to Boston Harbor too. He's going to be incarcerated. He's going to be freed in 1862. Guess where he's going to go? He's going to go to Montreal.
Oh my gosh! I was just thinking of Montreal, just because there is a bit of a Canadian connection to this. Many years later,
it gets even better with Kane. He's in Montreal in 1864. He's an operative in Canada now. That's what he's going to be doing for the Confederacy. He's going to meet with a young actor from Baltimore named John Wilkes Booth, who's going to talk to him about a kidnapping plot that he's going to hear about. And a year later, in 1865, he's now a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle in Baltimore, who'll meet again with Booth. Now, if you've seen the movie National Treasure 2, there's a scene at the beginning where the KGC operative meets with Ben Gates' great-grandfather, that scene in Washington. That character is loosely based on George Kane. That's
so cool.
But that's who he was. After the war, Kane becomes the mayor of Baltimore in 1877. And he's going to die in 1878. But when you look at the Pratt Street riot in the end, it's one of the uglier moments in all of American history. And it really foreshadowed what was going to come. A Union army fighting to put down a rebellion versus citizens defending their homes against what they consider an invasion by an enemy force. We hear that a lot about people in the South about fighting for the war. 1861, a Baltimore poet named James Randall. He's going to later become the president of Washington's Georgetown University. Go Hoyas, right? he's going to write a poem called Maryland, My Maryland, which would basically become the state's official song that was based on the Pratt Street riot. And it was the official song until just 2 years ago, actually, until they changed it. But the first stanza of this song, this poem that became the Maryland state song, it says, "The despot's heel is on thy shore, Maryland. His torch is at thy temple door, Maryland. Avenge the patriotic gore that flecked the streets of Baltimore, and be the battle queen of your Maryland, my Maryland." So the state song, the beginning of the state song, is written about the Pratt Street riot. That's how significant it was in Baltimore's history, Maryland's history. And it tells an interesting story of their attitudes towards the war, towards the North, how they consider themselves a southern state in Maryland, and how everything went bad. And when you think about these battles, you think about a lot of the stuff. You think about the linear formation, marching formation. This is a situation where this is complete mayhem. 4 Union troops died, 12 civilians died, all because they were walking through their city by 2 different sets who completely had different ideas of what they were supposed to be doing there. And it's unfortunate, but it really set the beginning off, and it really should have dispelled the notion that this was going to be a quick and easy war, just by how hard those Baltimore people are going to fight for this.
Oh, absolutely. And like I said, I think some of it's got something to do with the fact that these troops that were coming through were coming from the North, and they had witnessed something completely different than what they had seen in the North. You know, they're finally seeing how the Southerners feel about the war, and all of a sudden it's real. I do have an account that from after this, which is Howard's, shockingly. But Howard, he actually passes through Baltimore once they open up passage again with the 3rd Maine, who he's commanding. And this is, I'm not too sure how long after the riots, but he said, after the bloody passage of the 6th Massachusetts through Baltimore, a few days before our arrival in that city, the succeeding troops from the North had been conveyed to Washington in a roundabout way via Annapolis, thus avoiding the riotous mobs. My regiment was among the first to resume the direct route. In order to be able to protect ourselves in that city, I had ordered the men supplied with 10 rounds apiece of cartridges. So Howard is like, you know, I don't think anything would have happened, but he's obviously been kind of scared into thinking, yeah, it could. He and his men are going to have a police escort when they go through Baltimore to get from one station to the other. He said there was a huge crowd waiting for them. And of course, like he writes in his memoirs, I thought what had happened to the 6th Massachusetts was going to happen to us. Businesses were still closed when he was there, and Howard said the city was very gloomy. No flags were flying anywhere. And he said all people appeared under some fear of oppression. So you have to wonder if this is, you know, if he's passing through after habeas corpus, like what Lincoln did, if this is the effect of that too. And Howard ends up having dinner with a very Union-leaning gentleman who says, they declared that the bloody riot which had stained their streets with blood was not the cause, as claimed, but simply the occasion of the rebellious conduct of prominent city and state officials. And then Howard also says, matters just then, not only in Baltimore, but in many other parts of Maryland, were dark and uncertain. It was a critical period. Families were dividing and old friends at feud. So Howard's recounting of this, like going through there after the riots, seeing how it is, that it's dark and gloomy, businesses are closed down. He's seeing the aftermath of this and what it has done to kind of, you know, basically he says they're oppressed. That's his impression of it.
Yeah, I mean, it just, you know, the old adage is true. You're gonna fight for your territory, and that's pretty much what it was.
Yeah.
But it's certainly what it was. It was the war in a microcosm. It was defending against. It was volunteers versus citizens. It was however you want to call it. But it was certainly bloody. It was violence, and it was the first instinct that maybe, you know, these people for the most part didn't grow up with violence. I mean, they didn't. No. But they knew how to defend. They could rile each other up. Once that ball got rolling, once those 4 companies started running up the street, it was the dinner bell being rang, unfortunately. And you got to give credit to Brown, to Kane, even to Hicks for the most part, but especially Kane and Brown for doing what they could to protect those troops and get them through there. They had to think that when this was all said and done, they were going to be punished for it, which they certainly were. But again, it's a tough situation for all these guys to put up with that. And it was the beginning of what was going to be a long and brutal war. And that's unfortunate. That's the Pratt Street riot. It was the beginning. It really was. And a lot of people took notice of it. And then it wasn't too long after that you had the real fighting starting at Bull Run not far away.
Bull Run was not long after that. I mean, you flash forward kind of, it's 100 and something years later in Canada. We had our own thing in October of 1970 where our prime minister had to declare kind of martial law, suspend habeas corpus with the War Measures Act because of what was happening with basically a separatist group in Quebec with what was happening there. So similar situation, you look at pictures from Montreal at that time and where it was really, really bad. And it's kind of similar to what Howard describes. It's quiet, it's gloomy, businesses are closed down. It was a time, and that order, that War Measures Act was not just, it's not like in Baltimore where it's one place. Lincoln only had it going over a certain area. It was the entire country that was under that. But Montreal especially, I was looking at some pictures from it. It just reminds me kind of what Howard is describing of this kind of like, it's like they really shut down after that, with what happened.
It was. But it's a good story. It's definitely worth it. There's a lot of good sources you can read about this. But I would definitely, if you're interested in reading about that, do it because it tells a great story.
Yeah,
so what's coming up for us next?
I was going to say, first of all, the Baltimore riots is definitely something that needs to be studied more in the Civil War because it's kind of like the battle before the big battle sort of thing. Next for us, we are going to be having Dr. Peter Carmichael from Gettysburg College and Civil War Institute join us next week to talk about the Futch letters, which is a soldier who was in the Civil War. We're going to be talking about that. And then after that, we are going to be doing some episodes, Pickett's Mills, Spotsylvania, Andersonville, talking about some and tying those into some of the stuff that we've seen recently on our travels. We will be having another roundtable. We will be getting back to those in the month of May. We took April off from that just because both of us had a lot going on with traveling and school and work and all that. But yeah, and we will be announcing our next book club soon too, which is probably going to be happening in June or July.
Yeah, the Futch letters are interesting. If you haven't read those, it tells a very interesting story about a different type of soldier. You hear a lot about soldiers fighting for glory and they want to fight. It tells a story about a illiterate North Carolina soldier from the 3rd North Carolina who didn't want to be there, didn't want to fight, wanted to get home. All he ever wanted to do was get home. His brother gets killed at Culp's Hill in Gettysburg, and finally he's gonna leave. He's gonna go AWOL and he's gonna be caught. And it's a real sad story. But it's a really good one. So we'll talk about his letters. He was illiterate, so his letters were difficult to read.
His letters are really interesting to read. And just if anybody is wanting to have a look or read about that, Dr. Carmichael has them in his book, The War for the Common Soldier, which was released a few years ago. He devotes, I think it's a whole chapter. Am I correct, Darren? In that
he does. His book is soldier stories, but the Futch letters are interesting.
Yeah,
he's an expert, and he's right up our alley. Talk about soldiers and their stories, so we'll enjoy talking about that. So off we go, Mary. So any final words from you, Fincheru?
Oh, thank you for bringing it as you always do during this, and thank you to our listeners for supporting us through these 105 episodes. Don't know how we got here, but somehow here we are. So thank you for all that.
Yeah, it's been a good 105. So off to the next 105. All right, guys. So off we go. We appreciate you listening. So again, thank you for everybody who joined us in our book club earlier with Tim Smith, and appreciate the support. And we will talk to you all, as they say, on the other side.
Okay, see y'all later.
Peace out.
Bye.